Hey, everybody, and welcome back to Sip&Talk.
Great to be here.
Good to be back.
It really feels like we're constantly swimming in listener sources. The stack never seems to shrink.
It really doesn't, but it's fantastic.
It is. You all keep us so busy sending in the most fascinating, sometimes really head-scratching materials and questions.
Keeps things interesting, that's for sure.
Absolutely. We genuinely love it, though, so please keep them coming. It's, what makes these deep dives possible.
Totally agree. The perspectives you all share, the different angles, it's invaluable stuff for digging into these topics.
And speaking of fascinating, today we're diving into a collection of sources that touch on something getting a lot of attention.
Right. Recent official statements coming out of China?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Mostly concerning Taiwan and the U.S., say, over the last year or so, based on the materials we've got.
Yeah, we've been looking through quite a bit, detailing these specific statements, the language used, the context.
So our mission today is pretty clear. We want to unpack what's actually being said in these official remarks, explore why, they strike so many people outside China as kind of strange, maybe even absurd.
And how they're heard differently elsewhere. Big differences there.
Big time. And crucially, what do the sources tell us about the challenge, really, of pointing out contradictions in the language?
Yeah.
And maybe the mindset behind it.
It gets complex fast. We're talking deep-rooted views, significant communication barriers. The sources really dig into that.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What are these statements actually saying? Let's lay out the ground truth from the sources. Maybe start with the responses to Taiwan's leadership.
Sure. The sources show some really strong reactions, particularly aimed at Taiwan's President Lai Ching-te.
Yeah.
For example, after his National Day speech, October 2024, the sources quote China's Taiwan Affairs Office, the TAO.
Okay.
They said he kept preaching this new two-state theory of mutual non-subordination.
Right, that phrase keeps coming up.
Yeah, and accused him of fabricating Taiwan independence fallacies, inciting hostility, aggravating tension, and seriously undermining peace and stability.
Wow, that's quite a list of charges. Very direct.
Very. And the sources show similar language after his inauguration speech back in May 2024. People's Daily called him a Taiwan independence worker.
A worker. That's an interesting label.
Isn't it? Accusing him of promoting separatist fallacies, the two-state theory, mutual non-subordination again.
Okay.
And explicitly mentioning intent to, quote, rely on external forces for independence and seek independence by force.
So really framing him not just as politically opposed, but as actively dangerous and reliant on, well, the U.S., presumably.
That seems to be the implication. And it wasn't just words. The sources mention actions, too.
Like the sanctions.
Exactly. In May 2024, the TAO sanctioned some Taiwanese media figures. The stated reason, according to sources like CNA, was fabricating false negative information about the mainland. But the statement that went with it was striking. Silence and condoning evil is an injustice and harm to good.
Using silence and condoning evil to justify sanctions on journalists, that feels incredibly loaded. Very absolute language.
It does. And this kind of intense language carries over into the military sphere as well.
Right, the exercises. What did the sources say about the language used there?
Just as pointed, maybe even more so. During those encirclement drills, May 2024, the Eastern Theater Command spokesman called it a forceful punishment for Taiwan independence separatist forces.
Forceful punishment, okay.
And he used this vivid military imagery, mentioned J-20 fighters and phrases like sword's edge overlooking independence, chain locking independence, and arrow rain clearing independence.
Arrow rain clearing independence. It's almost poetic, but definitely menacing, designed to sound threatening.
Absolutely. And then there's the Defense Ministry spokesman, Wu Qin. The sources quote him saying, Taiwan independence provokes once, our countermeasure advances one step until the complete reunification of the motherland.
Kind of tit-for-tat escalation promise.
Seems like it. And then in February 2025, Wu Qin, again, responding to Taiwanese exercises, said something that really jumped out in the sources.
What was that?
We will come to catch you. It's only a matter of time.
Wait, we will come to catch you. That doesn't sound like standard military diplo speak.
Not at all. And the source actually points out it's a line from a popular Chinese animated movie, Neza 2.
An official military spokesperson is quoting a cartoon character in that context.
That's what the source says. It's, highly unusual.
Unusual is putting it mildly. Wow.
And this didn't stop. April 2025, the Straight Thunder exercises. Sources like the PLA Daily called Lai Ching-te a troublemaker, danger maker, and war maker.
Really personalizing it.
Very much so. And People's Daily repeated that principle. Provoke once, military pressure advances one step.
Okay, so the pattern seems clear. Any perceived move towards independence is met with escalation, and the language gets very personal, very emotional. What about reacting to other countries, like international comparisons?
Yeah, there was a notable one in May 2025. China's embassy in Singapore responding to French President Macron.
Oh, right, when he compared Taiwan and Ukraine.
Exactly. At the Shangri-La dialogue, the embassy statement called the comparison unacceptable, fundamentally different issues.
Okay.
But then they added this line. If one tries to accuse double standards with double standards, one will end up with double standards.
Huh. Accusing someone of using double standards by saying they're using double standards. That's a bit circular.
The sources definitely pick up on that kind of logic, yeah. So across the board, lie, the military stuff, international comments, the tone is just incredibly strong, very emotionally charged, not much room for nuance.
Which leads us right to the core question, doesn't it? Given these statements, the intensity, the cartoon quotes, the silence is evil thing, why do they land so weirdly for so many people outside China?
The sources spend a lot of time on this. They talk about absurd or unobjective examples and just this constant use of highly emotional, absolute language, especially criticizing the U.S. and Taiwan.
Yeah.
Full of terms like collusion, plotting, reckless, crazy march, and green authoritarianism.
Green authoritarianism. That one feels particularly crafted, combining a political color with a really negative term.
It does. And the sources point out what look like logical flaws in how these arguments are presented.
Like what?
Well, often a lack of concrete evidence for really strong claims, saying U.S. policy is the cause of instability, full stop,
Right.
or lies actions are the sole reason for potential conflict.
Right, making these huge causal leaps without showing the work, basically.
Exactly. Also ignoring complexity, especially the diversity of opinion within Taiwan. They often talk about people on both sides of the strait unanimously rejecting something.
It just isn't true, is it? I mean, Taiwan's a democracy, people vote, they have different views.
Precisely. It glosses over that reality. Another example the sources highlight, a commentary comparing democratic Taiwan now to the historical White Terror period.
Wow. That feels like a deliberate distortion of history to paint the present in a certain light.
That's how the sources frame it, yeah. Twisting history, ignoring the democratic transition.
It's like comparing, I don't know, modern Germany to the 1930s. It just doesn't track.
Right. And back to the military talk, justifying actions as proper and necessary, while, as sources note, completely sidestepping the actual concerns about escalation and risk felt by Taiwan, the U.S., and others. It's like they're not addressing the main point for external observers.
And that "we will come to catch you" line, quoting the cartoon.
Yeah, the sources flag that as just jarring. Using pup culture in official military comms combined with a threat, it adds to this feeling of it being unusual, maybe even sort of bizarre, in that formal setting.
Okay, let's try and unpack this. It's almost like, I don't know, imagine a top general quoting a meme in his serious press briefing about conflict. It just creates this weird disconnect, right? Especially with the aggressive tone.
It does. It doesn't sound like typical diplomacy or even standard military deterrence language as perceived from the outside.
And this disconnect, the source's stress, is perceived really differently depending on where you are.
Huge differences.
This is where it gets really interesting, I think. How do these same statements sound if you're listening in Taipei? Or D.C.? Or maybe Brussels?
The sources lay out some clear contrasts. From Taiwan, the feeling described is often hearing outdated propaganda, even like Cultural Revolution slogans.
Really?
That far back.
That's the comparison made. There's a sense of being threatened, bullied. One source uses the analogy of feeling like the mafia is talking to you.
Whoa.
And a really sharp point. The perception of zero self-reflection from China. It's described as feeling like an abuser blaming the victim.
Like an abuser blaming the victim. That's incredibly powerful and disturbing if that's how it feels to be on the receiving end. What about from the U.S. perspective?
In the U.S., the sources say it's mainly seen as anti-democratic, illiberal, aggressive, sometimes irrational. Some sources even compare the style to, say, North Korea's rhetoric. There's a strong perception of self-centeredness and hypocrisy, too, especially around that double standards charge.
Right, seeing China accuse others of things that seem to apply to their own actions. And then from other places, Europe, Japan, other democracies, the view is often that it just lacks basic diplomatic norms.
Too aggressive,
Overly aggressive, yeah.
Wildly.
Highly propagandistic.
Like.
Disconnected from global democratic values. And one source mentions a really chilling comparison.
What's that?
Comparing the language to Nazi Germany in the 1930s discussing annexation.
Wow. Okay, so invoking that historical parallel, that shows the level of alarm, the historical weight some people feel when hearing this.
Definitely. It highlights that these aren't just words being heard neutrally. They carry heavy baggage depending on your history and values.
So it's this massive gap in perception, which leads to the next big question the sources tackle. Why is communication so hard here? Why does this language keep going even if it lands so poorly outside?
Right. What's driving it?
So what does this all mean then? It's clearly not just a translation issue or picking the wrong words.
Oh, not at all. The sources argue it runs much deeper. It's presented as, like, the outcome of an entire system of ideological education. Concepts like, the country cannot split, Taiwan is part of China, the West is suppressing China, and the idea that supporting the state is justice. These aren't just opinions. They're taught as fundamental truths from a young age within that system.
So it shapes the entire way you're supposed to understand the world and China's place in it.
Exactly. And the sources also talk about it being tied to group identity, a kind of psychological defense, maybe involving cognitive dissonance, especially within a very closed information environment.
Right. If that's the narrative you hear constantly, anything challenging it feels like an attack on your identity, maybe.
That seems to be the idea. It makes it very hard to process conflicting views. And within this whole setup, the sources introduce this key concept, the self-righteous fallacy.
Okay, self-righteous fallacy. Break that down based on the sources.
They describe it as basically moral monopoly plus double standards.
Moral monopoly, meaning we decide what's moral.
Kind of. The logic goes like this, according to the sources. Our unity is justice. Others seeking independence is division. See? It's not a universal principle about unity or division. It's just what serves our interest is defined as just.
So the rule only applies one way. If it benefits us, it's good. If it challenges us, it's bad.
Pretty much. Another example. Taiwan is ours. Western interference is hegemony. But, the sources point out, this ignores their own military pressure as potentially hegemonic.
Right.
And that response to the double standards accusation we talked about, the sources say the logic often becomes, America uses double standards, therefore we are anti-double standard. It sort of uses the accusation itself to deflect criticism of their own potential double standard.
It's like saying you do it too, so we're justified. A kind of circular reasoning.
Exactly. And finally, dismissing Taiwanese public opinion as just being manipulated. The sources see this as a way to completely deny or invalidate the democratic will expressed there.
This analysis really helps explain the disconnect, doesn't it? It's not just about disagreeing on policy. It's like operating within fundamentally different frameworks of what right even means, reinforced by education, identity, and information control.
It creates a huge communication challenge, a massive barrier.
So, given how deep this runs, ideologically, psychologically, how do the sources suggest anyone could even begin to highlight the contradiction or, get through? Is changing minds even on the table?
Well, the sources are pretty clear. It's incredibly tough. You're probably not going to get some big, sudden breakthrough. Direct confrontation or refutation. The sources use the term kalochi, often backfires.
Why?
It can just trigger those defense mechanisms, the patriotic reflexes, people shut down. Instead, the sources suggest maybe guided questions could be more effective.
Guided questions, like what? More gentle?
Yeah, exactly. Asking things like, have you ever thought, maybe if you looked at it from this other angle, just trying to plant a small seed without forcing a defensive reaction?
Gently prompting someone to consider a perspective they might not have encountered before, perhaps.
Precisely. The sources also talk about using comparisons to expose contradictions, make people see inconsistencies themselves.
Okay, like what kind of comparisons?
They give a historical one. You say Taiwan can't split from China. Okay, but how about China splitting from the Qing dynasty to form the Republic of China? Or the CCP splitting from the ROC. Does China only count after the CCP took power?
Using historical precedent to question the absolute nature of the no-splitting rule. Depends on which split you're talking about.
Right. The idea, the source says, is just to make someone pause. Think, maybe it's not quite so absolute. Another example is political, comparing China's support for groups like Hamas while condemning Israel versus their absolute stance against any foreign interference regarding Taiwan.
Highlighting maybe an inconsistency in applying the non-interference principle, depending on the situation.
Yes. And the sources also float the idea of using non-political entry points first, talking about shared history or culture, philosophy, travel, finding common ground outside the really charged political stuff, maybe to build some rapport or gently open a mind before tackling the hard topics.
Starting somewhere less confrontational.
But ultimately, the sources are realistic. They talk about an ultimate reality here. You might not completely flip someone's core beliefs overnight.
Right.
But the goals of trying these approaches are maybe threefold. First, plant that tiny seed of doubt. Maybe it's not so black and white. Second, and this is important for everyone else watching, let observers see the contradictions, maybe the absurdity in the official language and logic. It's communication about the statements, too.
So partly for the speaker, partly for the audience.
Exactly. And the third goal the sources suggest is to show the world that this kind of rigid, absolute language, even though it sounds strong, might actually reflect a deeper fear and insecurity.
That's a really interesting way to frame it. The loud pronouncements as potentially masking anxiety, not just showing confidence, it really shifts how you might interpret it. Thinking about all this, the intense language, these deep communication barriers, the different ways it's heard around the world, and how hard it is to even discuss. Why is understanding this important for you listening right now, just trying to keep up with the world?
Well, because these statements aren't just, words floating in the ether. They come from a major global actor. They reflect core beliefs and intentions that have real consequences for international relations, for stability in Asia, for potential conflict, or just major misunderstanding.
Right. Understanding the language helps you understand the potential drivers behind actions and policies.
And more broadly, I think the skill of looking past the surface rhetoric, trying to understand the frameworks, the motivations, maybe even the insecurities behind official communication from any major player that's just crucial today. Navigating the news, the media, it requires that kind of critical thinking.
Absolutely. Thinking about how information and power work together on a global scale.
Which leads to maybe a final thought to leave you with. Drawing from the sources.
Okay.
Considering everything we've discussed, the layers of ideology, identity, the closed information system, is it actually possible for external dialogue or external pressure alone to really fundamentally change how these statements are made and how they're heard by the people inside that system?
That's a really tough question to sit with. It just underscores how complex this is, way beyond simple disagreements. Well, on that thought, thank you truly to all of you for sending in the sources that made this deep dive possible. We covered a lot, and it's entirely thanks to the material you share.
We really do appreciate your contributions immensely.
Please keep them coming. Sources, questions, ideas for what we should dive into next. There's always more to explore, and we really enjoy doing it with you.
Absolutely.
Oh, and hey, on a totally different note. A friend of ours has been making some really cool videos lately. Go find our old friend Micky's YouTube channel. Seriously, if you're looking for something interesting, maybe a bit lighter after all this geopolitics, check them out. They've been doing some great stuff on appreciating different flavors, seeing new places, just fun, insightful content. Worth a look if you need a change of pace.
Sounds good. Always nice to find interesting new things.
Definitely. So thank you again for joining us for this deep dive into the language of recent Chinese official statements. We hope it offered some valuable perspective on a really complex topic.
Hope it was useful.
We'll see you next time for another deep dive.